This is Ray Stokes in the Special Collection section of the TCOM Library here in Fort Worth. Today we're in the studios here in the Biomedical Communication section of the library. It's my pleasure today to welcome and recognize a very dear friend of mine, and I say friend, and I mean that sincerely, but we've grown up together, so to speak, in the osteopathic profession. I may be a year older than he is as far as tenure is concerned, but I'm referring to a very good friend of mine by the name of Wayne O. Stockseth from Corpus Christi. Now, Wayne, we're happy to have you here today, and you wear a number of hats, and I'd like to give you credit for all of them that you are wearing now and have worn in the past. But let's just start with the very beginning. I remember hearing the name Wayne Stockseth from Dr. George Lubel, who was chairman of our board. And then during the first year that I was hired back in '69. Seems like the first time I heard your name was February or March, something like that, in 1970, when Dr. Lubel says, Sam Gans, he's the DO down in Corpus Christi that was on the board. At that time, I think there were only 7 members on the board. And long about that time, you either became 8th or 9th or somewhere along in there. You were recommended to the Board of Directors of the Texas College of Osteopathic Medicine, which at that time was a private institution. When did you become associated with the osteopathic profession? I'll give you a chance to talk now.
Okay. Well, first of all, George Lubel, going back to you mentioning George as one of the 3 founders, George, I always, to this day, remember him as my chairman, my first chairman.
Right.
I guess sometime in 1964, 65, Dr. Sam Gans and his wife, Cindy, and my wife, Normally, and I lived sort of across the street from each other in Corpus Christi. And Sam and Cindy had a whole passel of kids, about 8 more or less, and Normally and I had 3 boys. And in the middle 1960s, they were all about 6, 7 years old. And we'd get home. I'd get home from my office, and Sam would get home from his office or the hospital, and we'd shoot hoops together with the kids, play basketball for about an hour and a half before dinner, and develop that friendship. And then we started playing racquetball together. And I think sometime around that time, after a year or so of that, we were coming out of the shower at the YMCA there, and I asked Sam, I said, Sam, I know you're a doctor, but what's an osteopath?
What's an osteopath?
And that was, I guess, my introduction. And Sam gave me a very brief little background and where he'd gone to school, and I guess like a lot of patients of osteopathic physicians, my first encounter as a patient with Sam was probably sometime within the next year, when I managed to, trying to play golf, managed to get my back all out of joint and couldn't hardly get out of bed, couldn't walk. And I remember Sam had told me about osteopathic manipulative therapy, and I thought, boy, this maybe he can help me.
Right.
So I called Sam and I said, Sam, boy, I've got this terrible pain in my lower back, and could I come see you? So I did, and Dr. Sam put me to work and did some manipulation on my back and gave me some Norgesic as a muscle relaxer, and gave me some exercise to do after I got my pain and the swelling and inflammation out of my back. And that, I guess, was my first encounter with osteopathic treatment.
I see.
And then it went from there, and I learned that Sam and his associates in his clinic there were certainly more involved in medical care than maybe some people even to this day probably realize, who might think of osteopaths as
sort of a
glorified maybe chiropractor
yeah.
type thing, and Ray, what was the doctor that wrote the book? You remember? You know what I'm talking about.
You mean
the quack doctor?
Phil Russell.
Phil Russell.
Yeah.
And Phil Russell, and Sam had got me a copy of that book, and I met Phil Russell, and I still have that book that I cherish, an autograph from Phil. And I began to realize that there was more depth to osteopathic treatment than manipulation of back and injuries of arms, legs, and backs and things like that. And I probably within the next year then. It's hard to exactly remember the time, but Sam asked me if I would be willing to serve on the Corpus Christi Osteopathic Hospital Board. And I guess I never will forget my answer. I said, Sam, I don't know the first thing about being a doctor. And he said, well, that's not what we need. He said, we've got a board that's made up of all doctors. And he said, you know, we need a businessman because running a hospital is a big business.
Right.
And, you know, we need someone to help evaluate our administrator, and we need these kind of things. And I said, well, fine, you know, could I come to a board meeting and sit in? So I did, and then sort of saw some of the things they were doing and felt that I could help and contribute. And I guess that's my first direct involvement and helped to the profession and started out at Corpus Christi.
Then you were rather seasoned when you actually joined the board as far as TCOM was concerned.
And then, you know, 5 years later, Sam mentioned to me that he said, you know, some of us are getting together and we'd like to have our own osteopathic college here in Texas.
Yeah.
And we've got option, or we've got some land up there in Fort Worth, and I had helped Governor Hobby and his Lieutenant Governor Hobby in his first campaign, and was his South Texas coordinator, and obviously, and even today with the state school, Ray, as you know, it's very important knowing the folks in Austin that you can talk to on a first-name basis. So I said, I think same thing. I said, Sam, I've got an office in Dallas, and let me know when the next meeting is, and let me come up and meet the folks and see what it's all about. And that's probably the weekend of the day.
Early 71.
Early, yeah, 70, something like that. So late 70, 71. And I came up and saw what they were trying to do. And
well, let me interrupt and maybe make a correction. I said early 71. Now, we opened the school in October of 70. Were we open at that time when you came up?
So it would have to be February 71, I think. Yeah.
Okay,
probably February, because the school was open.
It already opened.
Yeah,
okay.
And met Dr. Lubel. You know, that was an experience for those of us that know him. And,
right, absolutely. Heart as big as a watermelon.
Oh, heart as big as a watermelon. And he said, you know, we need, asked me, he said, how many people do you have work for your company? And I said, I don't know, 350 or 400. And, well, good, you know, we need someone we got a bunch of slots to fill.
Yeah.
And so I became, for some strange reason, I became the chairman of the faculty committee.
The faculty committee?
Yeah, I mean, it was sort of, you know, unusual. And so I started interviewing department heads. You know, you remember at that time just sort of putting the whole thing together.
That's right.
Anyway, we spent all those years. I think, things that I remember with great pride is that I know the board, when the idea of a merger, and I use merger as a businessman, the affiliation with North Texas as a businessman, I call it merger.
Anyway,
yeah, well, you remember Eddie Childs was on the board when I was on the board at North Texas, and Eddie used to say, you know, if we had a problem where he got mad at TCOM, maybe he'd say, well, we'll spin them off and get rid of them. I said, no, Eddie, this is not a public company. We're not going to spin the subsidiary off or do some of these funny kind of things. But anyway, I call it the merger. But Jitter, knowing he was president of North Texas, very much wanted and after I got appointed 10 years later or more to the North Texas board, you learn very rapidly, just like in business, any university president that's worth his salt wants to have a law school, an engineering school, a medical school. I mean, they're building just like a businessman is. And Jitter wanted and had the taste in his mouth for, you know, wanting TCOM. Wanted a medical school. And if you recall, during those years, we were doing all the basic science and hauling our students up to 2 years up to North Texas and on a bus back down here and back and forth. But I think going back to the pride thing, the board was very insistent that we graduate our first class of 16 as a private school. I think everyone had felt that we'd worked very hard. We'd begged and borrowed for money.
Yeah.
I mean,
let me correct you on the number now. It was 18 to graduate.
Was it 18?
Yeah, instead of 16. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad.
There were 20 who started, and 18
was 18 made it.
Yeah.
But, you know, if you remember, we graduated, probably those are the only diplomas that do not have North Texas State University.
That's right. That's the first 2 years, or 2 years, the class of 74 and 75.
Yeah.
The first 43 graduates.
Yeah. And, you know, we wanted to I feel, put that in place. I guess another thing that I will remember of the last board meeting before we all signed the documents to give what we had at that time to North Texas and the state of Texas was, I never forget, Sam Gantz and I, everyone of course was pretty excited because we were going to get massive amounts compared to what we were begging and borrowing,
right.
Massive amounts, what seemed like massive amounts of state funding.
At that time, we had a value of about $3 million, counting the little liquid assets and so forth.
And everyone begging and doing everything they could to whoever had any money, any foundation, any federal funds, any state funds, and those were fun years. But the original documents did not include, and we probably held Jitter up for 3 or 4 hours until they rewrote it, but did not include that this would be an osteopathic school in perpetuity. It was, we were going to give it to them, but as a businessman, my probably only contribution was reading that document, and I told George, I said, George, it doesn't say in here. You know, it doesn't say what we're all talking about. And George says, well, they've assured us. And I said, George, you guys have taught me what happened to the profession in California. If they're going to, if you know,
1960.
Right. If they're going to do it, if it's going to stay a College of Osteopathic Medicine, then by golly, let's have them put it down. And that's what you'll find in those documents today. So those are the, other than all, you know, the 4 years in between, all the fun we had in the building and the acquiring the land and the funny stories we used to tell about the apartment where they rented rooms by the hour. Well, at least we kidded about it.
Sophisticated brothel.
Exactly. Well, yeah, you know, just a high class. It was a nice part of town, so it had to be first class.
Right.
And but that was you know, that was a lot of fun. And of course, at that time, I had started, and I asked Sam Gantz that what were some of the things that my wife and I could do to recognize graduating seniors, and we started the what is now called, and was called at that time, the Stockseth Award, which...
That's right. I didn't get to lead you into that. Now, give us some in-depth information on that.
Sam...
you know, let me interrupt to say that you're best known from the alumni particularly, and, you know, we've got about 1,100, almost 1,200 now, and you're better known by them as the founding donor of the Stockseth Award, and also a sustaining supporter of that because you contribute to it this 17 years in a row now. Now go ahead.
Well, I asked Dr. Gantz, Sam Gantz, what kind of thing that he thought would be appropriate. And he said, well, Wayne, you know, as a layperson, you've really become a big, strong supporter for the profession, and the students that do well academically will receive all kind of awards. And what would you think if, and he said, whatever you want to do is, you know, fine with me and fine other members of the board, but whatever the recognition is, what would you think about giving it for excellence in osteopathic medical education and manipulative therapy and helping that department?
Right.
Because that's the first thing that I became really recognized what osteopathic medicine was about.
Right.
So that's really what the Stockseth Award is. It's voted on by the members of OM, Osteopathic Manipulative Therapy, Manipulative Medicine Department. The Scholarship Awards Committee signs off on it, and it's a recognition. It's a Rolex watch and an award that if you remember last week at the award ceremony, the recipient gets to hold the check.
He gets to endorse it.
Endorse it just barely, and it's then turned over.
Goes back to the scholarship.
Goes back to the scholarship committee to TCOM, and.
But now you also go a step further in an award that you're giving in addition to that, aren't you?
Well, that's a scholarship, and again, we'll give Sam Gantz the credit for that. My business was growing, and we were having a little more success, and I asked Sam that. You know, I said, boy, it's got to be awful tough on these young men and ladies going through medical school and run out of money. He said, oh, yeah, and he said the third year is the toughest because, you know, the first year they're sort of geared up.
Right.
They know they're going to be accepted. They got a little extra money saved. But by the third year, the wife's pregnant and she can't work and things are getting tough. So we give 2 scholarships to junior year students. Right. We try to not totally restrict them, but I've asked the awards committee, and on any of those awards, not that it makes any difference, Ray, but everyone does know, I think, should know that neither Norma and I do not know the name of the recipients until it's a done deal. In other words, all I do is furnish the watch and the money and the money for the scholarships, and I frankly, obviously wouldn't be here to correctly evaluate. So, you know, sometimes when I get politicked, I tell people, don't politic me, I don't have a vote. Right. I mean, it's got my name on the award, but I don't have a vote.
Right.
And so, anyway, we give 2 scholarships to students that we hope would at least consider practicing in South Texas and would consider practicing in a smaller community that the profession has been so recognized as providing medical care for. And I will say this, out of 16 years and 2 scholarships, 32 of those, you could probably tell me for sure, but I know probably half of those that I can probably, if I set my mind to it, you know, are practicing in McAllen and in Alice, Texas, and in Farr and in Brownsville and
Kirbyville,
Laredo, and yeah, in small communities in South Texas.
That's right.
And I guess what got me really thinking about that, our ranch is at Devine, and Devine's a small city of about 1,100 people, and at the time, there's a DO there now.
Where is Devine?
Well, it's sort of southwest of San Antonio. Yeah. But I got thinking, tell Norma one time we're at the ranch.
Anywhere, is that in the Uvalde country?
A little bit more to the east.
I see.
And at that time, there wasn't even a doctor in town. And I thought, well, if we could help some deserving folks and do the scholarship, so we did that. After the merger, of course, with North Texas, the school came under the direction of the North Texas State University Board of Regents.
Board of Regents, right.
And Dr. Gantz and Dr. Lubo and all the rest of us that had the 5 wonderful years as a private school board were retired, I guess. Yeah. Didn't even get a gold pin or anything.
No, you really didn't.
We just, everybody said thank you, and Jitter had his medical school, and I went off and built my business, and so that had to be like 1975, and
August 31st.
Yeah, August 31st, 75.
I'll never forget what Dr. Lubo said to Mr. Willis at the time when they made the transfer. You know, he said, it's kind of like a father losing a bride, but he's glad to know that that the bride's going to a husband that he approves of.
Yeah, good family, yeah.
A good family.
Yeah.
Before, the one distinction that you have, I don't know whether anybody's called it to your attention or not, but you are a first and only, as far as I know, at this given time. I don't know that anybody will ever duplicate it. Possible, of course. But you not only were on the first board of directors of TCOM when we became a state, you later became a member of the Board of Regents, which is also our governing body now.
Right.
And you were chairman of that for 3 years, long about 85, 86, 87, somewhere in there. But before we get any farther into our discussion here, Wayne, let me say that just a brief biography of Wayne Stockseth. Now, I believe you were graduated from Cal State University at, where is that located?
Sacramento.
Sacramento, in 1953, is that
right.
correct? Of course, I've read this, but I can't remember it all, you know. But anyhow, then you... how did you and Norma Lee, how did you meet her?
Well,
how were you fortunate enough to...
After I finished school in 1953, that was a period where you had the compulsory military service. And I was a young man, wanted to see the world, and so I thought, what better way than being a naval aviator? So I went through the flight program and ended up at the end of that period of time in my last year in Corpus Christi as an instructor. And thanks to a hurricane that was headed towards Corpus Christi, our admiral said we ought to take all the planes and fly them away. And of course, being a bachelor, living in the bachelor's officer's quarters, I got a call one Saturday morning in 1956, said that, you know, get a plane, get a student, and take the plane someplace. So I did, and ended up in Dallas. Had been a best man at one of my students' wedding, and one of the bridesmaids was a Tri-Delt from SMU, and she gave me her name and number and said, if you're ever in Dallas, give me a call. Well, after landing about 1 o'clock in the afternoon and I think playing AC-doocy and card games and drinking beer and sitting around, I remembered this young lady's name and called her up, and seemed that she had a date. I mean, I couldn't understand how, just because it was Saturday afternoon at 6 o'clock and I called a good-looking gal at the Stridell House on a Saturday, she couldn't, I mean, she wasn't just sitting there waiting for me, but
right.
she
happened to be available.
Happened to be available. Well, she wasn't, unfortunately. So I said, well, there's bound to be. I said, I've got a bunch of neat bachelor naval aviators and some of our students, and we're out here at Grand Prairie at the Naval Air Station, and why don't we just come down and get you girls, and they're having a dance out here tonight and a dinner. And anyway, she put a group of girls that didn't have anything, and my wife of 33 years happened to be a pledge.
Where was she from originally?
From Corpus Christi.
Corpus.
Isn't that strange?
It sure is.
So I fly 400 miles to Dallas. Anyway, normally brings one carload out with her. She had a car, and she came out, and we didn't hit it off real well, but 2 years later we got married. I mean, you know, she kidded me about California, anybody, that's the land of fruits and nuts and all that, and I kidded her about being from so far south. She was almost in Mexico, and you know, it didn't get off to a very good start. But we had our second.
You had a second chance.
Well, we had a second date because that night some of the girls that she had brought out sort of liked some of the students that we had up there, and since normally he had the only car, well, they wanted to have another date, and so normally he had the car, and so I said, okay, I'll come along, because see, I had a date with this girl that I called the first time.
I see.
Sunday was we were gonna go to church and eat chicken and go out in the afternoon and do something. Well, anyway, I ended up, because all my other friends, so the good Lord must have been looking at me, Ray, and anyway, we got along much better that next day. We got along good that first time, but normally, as you know, is a great kidder, and we jabbed each other all night long, and anyway, 2 years later, we got married and started having our family. Of course, as I mentioned earlier in the interview, that's how our children and the Gans
Well, in other words, when you got out of the Navy in Corpus, you just stayed in Corpus.
I stayed in Corpus and went in business in Corpus, and
okay, let me ask you this. I know that you make a life by being a member of the Methodist profession or confession or faith, and you also make a life out of your interest in osteopathic medical education. But now you make a living, and I knew the name of your old company, the Show Financial Corporation, but you say you've reorganized and you've got some sons that are involved in it.
You
now,
know,
what's the name of, you're an entrepreneur and investor, but what's the name of your company now?
Well, I'll tell you the name after I tell you our mission statement.
Okay.
Our mission statement says that the SLM group, SLM, that's for our three sons, Stephen, Lee, and Mark.
Stephen, Lee, and Mark.
Stephen, Lee, and Mark. SLM Group, Inc. is a marketer and distributor supporting the heavy-duty transportation industry. What that means is we sell heavy-duty trucks and equipment. We sell replacement parts. We have shops that repair people's heavy-duty vehicles.
Right.
We have 13 operations around the country. We operate in Texas and in Oregon. Original company that I founded doing aircraft refueling. When I got out of the Navy, that's the business I started. We still do that. We do that in 8 locations around the country. That corporation is called Avantra Corporation, and we fuel the jet airplanes at places like Naval Air Station, Key West, Florida, Jacksonville, Alameda, Florida. And there's a lot of equipment involved, so the whole company, the parts business and the trucking company, the truck sales company, was really an outgrowth out of the government contracting company. But to go back to my love here, TCOM, 10 years goes by, and Mark White runs for governor, and I helped him, and subject came up between some of the members of the state association and the governor's office of was there any appointment that I might like to have, or that the governor might consider granting me?
Right.
And I think at that time,
What'd that be, about 83 or 84?
83 or 4, yeah, when Mark's first campaign, I guess, was 84.
Yeah.
I think at that time maybe the communication between TCOM and North Texas was not as good as we all would have.
Not as desirable as we'd like
as we'd all like it to be, and
right.
And I had continued, of course, to give the awards and continued to give the scholarships and made trips up here, and I just honestly felt that you know, we were going through some troubled times. They weren't financial like they were in the first 5 years. We had certainly plenty of good state funding.
Right.
Texas economy was good, Ray.
$30
you know that.
a barrel then.
Yeah, and so it wasn't the dollars, but you know, the school was going through not the best of communications with its sister school up in Denton.
Right. Right.
And so I went to Austin and asked Governor White that I'd like to serve on the North Texas State University Board of Regents. And the state association was very supportive of my candidacy. So I was appointed. Same time, Joe Green,
Mean Joe Green
of the Pittsburgh football hero days, and the North Texas graduate, was appointed. Dean Davis, attorney from Austin, and Becky Garth, and Jack Hayes. And that was the 5 of us that were appointed, and
who was the chairman of the Regents at that?
Win Brown.
Win Brown.
Win Brown was chairman, and continued. And I thought it was an indication of the support that the members of the Board of Regents had for both schools, in that even though Governor White had 5 appointments and the board is made up of 9 people, the board continued and voted Win Brown in as chairman, because I think the feeling was that we wanted to divorce maybe the political politics of the appointment, unlike the A&M and Texas board, where the immediate thing is, well, we're going to go get rid of those other guys, you know.
Right.
And this board, and I think Al Hurley would tell you that, and I think Dave Richards would tell you that. Chancellor of both institutions. He's been blessed with a board that, even though we may have been appointed by different governors, and as you know, Texas has now gone through Governor White, gone through Governor Clements, and then Governor Clements back again after Governor White. All my experience with the board has been that we have never discussed politics.
Incidentally, and I don't want to discuss politics any more than ask you this question that you can answer if you see fit, but all things being equal, would you agree to be on the Board of Regents again?
Well, I think that'd be up to the next governor.
Well, I know it'd be up to the next governor, but you wouldn't accept it if...
you know, I've decided that, as you say, I make my living in SLM Power Group. My church, my family, and this college and University of North Texas are, you know, those are the things that I want to do.
Right.
You know, that's what I want to do.
I just hope you're fortunate.
So if...
or I hope the state's fortunate. I'll put it that way.
Well, if
would enhance,
you know, either way,
enhance our relationships if we could have you a little closerly, a little more closely identified.
Well, I'm always going to be there to help, and but yes, it'd be an honor.
In that respect, Wayne, you've received a lot of honors and accolades. I can remember one of the first honors that you received was, I think, about 1979, when you were the recipient of one of the what I call highly coveted medals of honor, or Founders Medal.
I received it in the first year. If you remember, the 3 founders received the Founders Medal, and I received mine the second year, and I was very proud of that.
79.
Very proud of that.
That's right. And you and I have one thing in common. I got mine in 1984, or 83. I can't even remember the year. No, it was 84.
84, yeah.
That's right. That was the year I had the pleasure of addressing the convocation of incoming students. Back to you, though. You have been recognized in the national circles You're a member of some committee, very important committee that you and Dr. George and Dr. Burnett met recently in Chicago, something to do with the National Osteopathic Foundation. What is that?
Well, after the school became part of North Texas, friends on the AOA board asked me to serve on the National Osteopathic Foundation board. And I did. I served with that as its vice chairman, and did the normal businessman's kind of thing. We sort of revamped their books and their procedures and put some marketing programs together. We probably added 50 or more new sponsoring members to the NOF board. I think for that and for other things, the AOA gave me the Distinguished Service Award. I think it's been given in the entire history of the profession. I think they told me 6 different times is all. In 100 some odd years.
Yeah.
So, and it was for contributions through, contributions to osteopathic medical education.
Right.
This last November, as I mentioned to you, I received from the Association of American Osteopathic Colleges,
Right.
The William Miller Award.
Is Dave Richards still president?
Dave Richard was president of that. But I have continued to try to help the profession in any way I can in this school with the scholarships and the awards, or politically or any other way I could. And I guess probably after my term, I shouldn't say I was replaced, my term finished on the board of Governor White's appointment. Governor Clements got elected. The AOA asked me to serve on that's the Committee for Funding for Research. And
that was the purpose of your meeting the other day.
That was the meeting. We were in Chicago the other day, and the profession has raised the dues to the membership, and there will be about $500,000 a year that will be available for osteopathic research. And Ray, as you I'm sure probably know, of all the wonderful things the profession has done, they have not really been known, nor have had the money, nor the schools such as TCOM to do the research that they now can do.
That's correct.
And so I'm really proud to be a part of that and get involved with that. My service on the Board of Regents, I appointed in 1983.
Yeah, give us a little in-depth, behind the closed doors experiences you may have had in some outstanding meetings that.
Well, I think we're sitting in Med Ed 3 right now, but our main building, Med Ed 1, I'd like to share that story with you.
I wished you would.
It's about a year after North Texas assumed control of this school. As you know, there were plans submitted for Med Ed 1.
Right.
And funding was
Ralph Willard was our dean.
Ralph Willard was our dean, and Jitter Nolan was the president. And I got a phone call one Thursday evening at my home in Corpus Christi, and it was Dr. Nolan that said that the $17.5 million funding for Med Ed 1 was just down the tubes. They just weren't going to get the money. And and he knew, of course, that I had worked for Governor Hobby, and he said, we've tried everything we could, and we've asked everybody we could. Betty Andahar was the senator handling the thing. And he asked me if I'd be willing to talk to Governor Hobby, and I never will forget it because it was pouring rain, sort of like this entire spring this year.
Right.
And I couldn't get a plane from Corpus to Austin, but I got in my car at about 5:30 and got up to Austin at whatever time it took to drive there, 3 hours, 3.5 hours, and was able to get Governor Hobby. He was in his apartment, and we sat down and visited about TCOM and the need for the school, and it was now part of North Texas State University. And he asked me why, and I told him about my service on Corpus Christi Osteopathic Hospital Board and how much I believed in this school and the profession, and that I could assure him that the state sure needed the kind of doctors that this school was turning out, and talked about our ranch and just every story I could think of to convince him to get the Senate to fund the money to build Med Ed 1 so we could get on with it.
Right.
And we sat there till about midnight, and told me, he said, be here in the morning. And I checked in the hotel and came early in the morning and show you how the value of friends in politics. Senator Anhart came up to me and she said, what happened? And I said, Betty, I don't know what happened. She said, well, Governor Hobby told me just to introduce the bill. And she said, we're going to introduce it, and we got our $17.5 million.
For goodness sake.
So,
repeat that a little louder.
well, Med Ed 1, but it wasn't me, right? It was it was a friendship I had with Hobby, but the school and what it did and what it accomplished. It's not that, if I've learned anything in helping people in politics, one very, very good friend of mine, very close friend of my father-in-law, ended up being president of the United States, told me one time, he said, Wayne, your friends in politics will do a lot of things for you, but they won't go to jail for you. No. But, if you've got a good story and you've got a good project, or you've done your work, they'll help you.
Yeah, who are you referring to?
President Johnson.
Yeah.
And I was, fortunate. My wife's father was a very good friend of Lyndon's and made a lot of trips to Washington and got to sit and listen to all his stories and humorous tales, and had a great way of making points about things. Anyway, we as you know, we got Med Ed 1 and proceeded on along, and my involvement, I guess, for 8 or 9 years was during that period of the scholarships and the awards and trips to the school, and then we're to the point of my appointment on the board, and served that first year as chairman of the facilities committee. If you remember, we were just finishing Med Ed 2 at that time.
Right. That's where Governor Hobby broke the ground for that.
Right. And if you dig out some of your old photographs, if you remember, we got Bill in his T-shirt.
Right.
That said,
sure did.
Marcus
Welby
is a DO. Right.
Right.
Yeah. And Bill Hobby has been
a copy of that.
Bill Hobby has been a good friend of this school and of this profession.
Well, he got a Founders Medal a few years back.
Sure did.
Yeah.
Sure did. Yeah. Sure did. Yeah, in fact, he kissed me. He said, I don't know why you got yours so far ahead of mine. I said, well, I worked a lot more on it. He said, where'd you get the money for Med Ed 1? I said, no, Bill, that's not fair. That's not fair to say anything like that. But anyway, we continued on along, and we went through the.
Now these were the years that you were chairman. Weren't you?
Well, I was on the board, and really what I was looking for was what were the reasons why the communication between North Texas, the board, and the school down here, and the state association.
Yeah, state association
was not the best, and they're
not a strong adversary, but still.
Well, there was
in opposition.
There were a lot of personalities involved. Mm-hmm. I really think, in all honesty, everyone had the best interest of the school at heart.
Right.
There were just different ways to get to the same place. Mm-hmm. And different plans.
Right.
Let's just say that I'll go back to another Bill Hobby story. When I was chairman, when I was elected chairman, and if you remember, we were not getting the best press out of the Fort Worth papers.
No, that's right.
And our students were not doing very well. And none of this is really my guesses. This is a matter of record.
Right. Mm-hmm. The flex experience.
The flex experience. And I went down to talk to Bill, and Bill said, Wayne, let me tell you something. He said, Bill Hobby.
Bill Hobby.
Bill Hobby. He said, Wayne, there's probably 2 or 3 members of the Senate that will never support osteopathic profession. They're very close to the allopathic people, and you're never going to get their votes. And there's probably 2 or 3 or 4 that will support TCOM and the osteopathic profession, regardless of what you do. Yeah. They're just committed like these folks over here. Yeah. And he said, then there's a whole body of people in the middle that make up the majority of the Senate that really are concerned and are being politicked by various interests because of the difficulty that the graduates of this school have had with all the money that the state has poured in, that the difficulty they've had passing a state examination. And these folks are starting to be influenced by, why are we pouring 20 or 25 or $28 million plus a $25 million building, but the operating funds and everything, that the salaries and the operating expenses and everything come from. You know, if the graduates we turn out cannot pass the licensing examination in the state, and these people are fleeing to Iowa or Indiana or California, whatever, why should we do it? And I said, Bill, I understand. He says, well, let me make it real clear. He said, I think your budget request is $26.5 million for this next year. Get the students to pass flex, and you get the $26 million. If you don't, you probably stand a chance of having something happen to the school. And at that point, I think I came back with a feeling that we had to find out why we weren't passing flex. And Ray, that I guess this gets to the part of the tape where I'd like you to hold it for 5 or 10 years anyway to you know, let time go by.
Very good.
But
We'll make a
you
note
know,
of that.
I think that I think what happened to the board, it became known as the Dr. Richards Black Book. It was a very thick report that analytically and statistically traced the students that had gone through the school and those that had trouble with flex, and what their grade point average was, what their grade point average in basic science was, what their MCAT scores were. And if someone, and all 9 members of the board had a copy of this, if someone with a normal amount of intelligence would read it, you would seem to come to the conclusion that you didn't need to be an educator to realize that if you were low on your MCAT scores, if you were low on your basic science scores, if you were low on your grade point average scores, that in all probability, you were not going to do very good in flex. But I think the chapter of the book that really convinced the board that we needed to put, I think Dr. Richards calls them the, 17 points or, anyway, we sort of passed a manifesto.
I thought he called them 39.
30, well, whatever.
38 or 30.
Whatever it was, there's a whole bunch of raising standards doing, and a lot of these things, quote, I got credit for, but it was the board as a whole saw the need. But the real thing that really got everybody, because at that point there was also a lot of conversation about, well, flex is an unfair examination. The osteopaths don't have input in the flex. You know, it's not really fair. And of course, I'm always, every time somebody would bring that up, mainly state association people, I'm hearing in my mind Hobby saying, I don't want to hear about flex. That's how we license your doctors, and if they can't practice in the state, we ain't going to give you the money. You know, so that, I mean, forget about the politics of whether it's an unfair exam or not. If we want the money, if not, we ought to pick the school up and go someplace else. But the one chapter that really hit it, to the board members and to me, and when I had my copy delivered to me, I was staying in Dallas near my office. It was delivered to me at 10 o'clock at night. I sat up till 4:30 in the morning and read it from cover to cover. It was basically reports from all the departments all the way through this whole school, analytical data. But the chapter that really hit it was the students that had trouble and were unable to pass flex also were unable to pass National Osteopathic Boards. So it wasn't, it really, maybe there was no osteopathic input on flex, but the students weren't doing good in any of the standards. Even if we could separate ourselves, as some of the factions were saying, well, let's divorce it, let's pass a state law or something that we're going to put ourselves over here and we're going to license our students with only National Osteopathic Boards. First of all, I don't think it would ever pass, and I frankly think politically it would be a disgrace, and I have told the State Association many times my opinion on it is that if they ever caused a bill to be passed that the students of this school could get licensure without having to pass flex, it's like we are not up to the standards of the other medical schools in the states, and we therefore need our own little test over here to make sure our students get through. Now, I don't really, I have a lot of very good allopathic doctor friends. And I never have wanted to get in discussion of the DOMD arguments, because first of all, I'm not qualified. But what we readily saw was we had to put in place higher admission standards, better review of teaching methods, all the things that when you interview Dr. Richards someday, he can tell you about the points that, and as chairman, I instructed with the board's 100% blessing to ask Dr. Richards to come in with recommendations, because as you know, David at that time was our Dean for Academic Affairs.
Right.
That was his job. And I asked Dr. Willard to get Dr. Richards to come up with some suggestions to put in place some changes in standards. Privately told the board, in executive session, and the chancellor, and Dr. Willard, I believe Dr. Richards was also there, what Governor Hobby had told me. And I went through probably 6 or 8 to 9 months of a little fear, because I was very close to getting into operating a medical school, or I thought maybe I was.
Yeah.
And you learn on a board like the Board of Regents that you don't do that, like any board. You hire a chief executive officer to do the job. If he doesn't do the job, you have to make a replacement. But I had the advantage that I did know many of the members of the private school board. I knew many members of the AOA. I knew the accrediting teams. And they knew that I was not in any way ever going to do anything to hurt the school or hurt the profession.
Right.
And so even though I had some people probably get a little upset with me for causing some things that had to be done.
Such as changing presidents?
Well, maybe changing presidents, but that's another story. Dr. Willard was given every chance to allow Dr. Richards to put those things in place. And I would like, and I think it would have been a lot better for everyone concerned if we could have had a realization that things were changing. We were not talking about the battles of 1940 and 50 in the osteopathic profession. Sometimes, and you and I are getting a few more gray hairs too, sometimes we seem to remember all the things that happened in the past. But anyway, we put them in place, and as you know, our students have done very well on Flex. And
speaking of Flex, I guess that's what they're doing right now.
Oh, is that right?
Flex started this morning.
Good.
Sure. Well, I don't know how many. I haven't heard how many we've got taking it, but.
Well, Ray, I've about run out of things to talk about.
Well, I tell you, you've done a good job, Wayne, and your memory is better than I thought it'd be, to be honest with you. But are there any particular wishes that you not wishes, but expression that you have about what you would like to best be remembered? This is kind of a trite remark, but still at the same time it has a lot of merit to it. What would you like to best be remembered for in your association with the osteopathic profession, and particularly TCOM?
Friend of the school and a friend of the profession.
Friend of the school in capital letters, I hope.
I do.
Absolutely. Well, you proved that beyond the measure. Wayne, it's been a pleasure to have you come up from your, let's see, you have a business, you have an office in Dallas, but your main office is in Corpus Christi.
Yeah, live in Corpus Christi.
And, one thing about it, it's my pleasure to interview people who've had some connection with the school from its beginning. And, of course, you're not near the end. You should be at the head of the line instead of the end of the line as far as I'm concerned, but you'll probably be one of my last interviews because I'm setting it in cement. I'm retiring the 1st of September.
Well, maybe we'll somehow work out that thing we talked about the other night.
I hope to come back as a consultant.
There you are.
Working with the foundation. Maybe that. In fact, I think I've got a meeting coming up pretty soon to discuss that and become a reality. Wayne, give our regards to your lovely family, and particularly your wife. And I met one of your sons. I don't believe I've met all of them. One of them had to substitute for you one time a couple of years back.
Yeah, sometimes we do some business overseas, and sometimes the schedule comes up that I can't go. But my heart's always here.
You made a great contribution to the profession as well as to this particular school. And again, we thank you very much for being with us today. This is Ray Stokes. I believe this happens to be the 11th day of June, 1990. Signing off.